All right, hey everybody, it's Chris Duncan here with another edition of the Daily Duncan. Very fortunate today to have Greg Daddis, who's professor over at Chapman University. He's going to talk about some really sort of things that he's going through as professor, and also some important kind of comparisons based on his expertise and the things we're going over and going through today with the COVID-19 crisis. So really fortunate to have Greg on. Greg is a professor of history and the director of Chapman University's master's program in War and Society. And he joined Chapman after heading up the history department at the U.S. Military Academy, also known as West Point. And he's a retired U.S. Army colonel, which is, if you don't know, a very high rank. And he served in both Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom. He's written a number of books on the Vietnam War and the Cold War, and published a number of op-eds in major publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times. So Greg's got a lot of experience with some of the things that we're all thinking about, in particular the U.S. military and I guess the United States government's sort of wartime position in the past and how that might relate to what we're going through today. And he's just a really distinguished guy, obviously a professor, so important there, engaging with our young folks. And more than anything, and don't get embarrassed or anything, Greg, but he's a cool guy. If you go on his Facebook account, this guy's cool, right? And he presents himself in a very relatable way, in a polished way, but a way that sort of demands respect. And that's one of the things that kind of caught my eye when I first heard him speak at a Veterans Day event in Mission Viejo last year. So Greg, thank you very much for joining us today. Really,
thanks for having me on.
Very honored to have you on. Okay, before we get into the sort of the substance and some of your perspectives on things that are going on today, why don't you just tell us about what it's like to be a professor, these days in this distance learning environment over at Chapman, and what's the experience for you given the situation we're
in? Weird. It's not what we obviously all signed up for, and very early on when we kind of moved it from classroom teaching to online teaching, and the very first class where we had this Zoom remote teaching session, and I had on the screen 26 students in my class. They were so excited to see each other because they hadn't seen each other for a few weeks. School was kind of gone to remote learning just before spring break, and so they hadn't seen each other for a while, and it was really kind of touching to see how much they missed each other, and I think as we've been doing this now for almost a month, how they miss the connections in the classroom environment. And I've just been really proud of them overall. They've made the transition really well. They're staying engaged as best as possible with the material. And they're still doing the work, and it's really just
right. And yeah, I mean,
to be proud of.
Isn't it interesting how sometimes these difficult times make us appreciate the things we might not have appreciated before, and maybe bring us together? And I really like that. Right? I mean, that was talked about as part of my campaign, to sort of bring people together, and how much we realize, gosh, we really do sort of care about each other. We like to be close. We like to be connected. And how do we do that now in this disconnected environment? And hopefully, in a way, it does bring us together. And we're talking about how some folks are really struggling these days, and both of us, of course, are pretty fortunate. But regardless of your situation, this is a time where we can reach out and sort of be there for each other, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they need that. I mean, I've seen it with my students. I think they actually still enjoy coming to class. Coming to class is different. Many of them I see in the background, they're sitting on their beds or their home, and I'm sure that's difficult. But you can just see on their faces, they enjoy being with each other, even if it's only remotely.
Wow. Yeah. Very cool.
So I think there's something definitely to that, even introverts, I think, need some type of connection. And I think this really says something about just how social we are as human beings, right?
Sure. Yeah, well, good to see that you're able to carry on there. All right, so let's get into it. Uh, one of the things that I've again have heard you speak. I've sort of checked out your books, seen some of your posts on Facebook. One of the things that I've heard you talk about is about sort of civility and how do we talk to each other when we disagree, and uh, whether it's okay to have maybe a healthy skepticism of say political leaders, even from folks in the
Right,
military. Does that make you unpatriotic? Does that make
right,
you unable to you know to to have a proper discourse? Do you have
right.
anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think so. Early on in my military career, I forget what senior officer said this to us. It was a group of officers, and he said, "Look, what's really important for you to understand is that you can be skeptical, but don't be cynical. And there's a difference, right? That skepticism is healthy and questioning up to a point, obviously in the military, right? That it's okay to ask questions and push back, but never be cynical. And I think that's always been a healthy way to think about how we have discourse with each other. That disagreement does not equal disrespect, or it shouldn't. And if I'm questioning something, it doesn't mean that I'm disrespectful. It doesn't mean that I'm not patriotic. I'm teaching a class right now on Vietnam, and we just had the last two lessons on the anti-war movement. And clearly, there were critics during the Vietnam War era and historians today that argue that these anti-war activists and dissenters were unpatriotic, and actually that's not true at all, right? That they were very patriotic and wanted the nation during this time of war in the 1960s to be better, just as politicians who were advocating for the war in Vietnam were just as genuine. So I think the sense of empathy is important, that trying to understand where the disagreement lies, why the disagreement exists, and then trying to come to some sense of mutual understanding. And then obviously, if you're a policymaker, to come to some type of consensus where we can do better. And I think, unfortunately, we're in a moment in time where just the word consensus
It
is,
seems so elusive, right?
yeah,
You're almost shocked if there's some kind of an agreement or a compromise.
right, right,
Yeah, I mean, I really think that we should not be sort of judging each other, right? Judging each other
right,
based on our beliefs or our positions on things. Rather, we should leave the judgments on character for something else. But on our disagreements, I think that we probably have more in common than we think, and it certainly would be nice to see our political leaders set aside some of these political agendas in favor of things that actually the wide electorate agrees on, and focusing on those.
right, right.
Um, all right. Well, so you've talked a lot about. Let me just finally sort of round that out, because it leads into to the next topic.
Mhm.
Uh, One thing I've noticed about you is that sometimes when you see yourself in those situations, right, there are people who challenge you on some of your posts, or challenge you. I know they challenged you, I think, essentially when you gave that speech on Veterans Day, which I thought
Right,
was interesting. There were people in the crowd who didn't exactly go along with everything you were saying, which is what sort of piqued my interest, right?
right.
One way I've seen you deal with that is through humor. You've parried some of those kind of attacks with humor, and I can see right away that you really deaden the kind of force of it, and you kind of get the other person engaged. Is that something you do intentionally, or is that you've picked up over time, or is that just
I try to. Yeah, I try to, and I think in part of it is if you can take some of the emotion out of the argument, it's much easier than to listen, right? I think sometimes we get so angry and emotional that we kind of turn off our ears, and so um, a small bit of humor to kind of uh, decrease that level of emotion, I think oftentimes helps, and then can get you on the same platform with somebody else to then have a conversation. I mean, for me, I think it's helped being a historian of the Vietnam War. where there's obviously a strong veteran community in the United States, and a lot of disagreement about what happened in the Vietnam War and why it ended up the way it did. And I've been very fortunate, I think, to be able to share some of my research and scholarship with veterans, and not all of them agree, but it's been important, I think, to have those conversations with that kind of community who's very committed to, given the sacrifices that they shared during the 1960s and early 70s, and always ensure that if I'm not agreeing with a veteran of the Vietnam War, that I'm never doing it in a way that's disrespectful, because it's just not healthy at all.
Right.
And so I think that has helped me, because they've got, that veteran community, especially for Vietnam veterans, is amazingly diverse, and they're well read, and they try to put their own experiences into some sense of historical context. They're smart. They understand the larger context, and that's exactly, I think, the kind of dialogue that's necessary for us. So that, for me, has been really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Good to hear. Yeah, I think it just makes you more sort of, human, that people, it's hard to
Right.
tap somebody that's kind of, that's saying something that kind of we all agree is humorous.
Right.
So yeah, that's a great tactic. I want to try and pick that up. And we certainly have a lot of military veterans in Orange County, right? Especially in South Orange County. So
Right.
it's an important group to connect with here locally. So talking about the Vietnam War, and I think it was last year or the year before, I watched Ken Burns' The Vietnam War documentary series, which was just absolutely incredible. As someone who didn't actually go through, the war, but has sort of, I think it was my dad's friends, right? Like I knew some of those guys and watched the movies and things like that. Platoon, all time, one of my favorite movies.
Right.
But so you've written about that, and you've mentioned it, a couple of times while we're talking here. Is there something about that war that has always sort of stoked your interest, or sort of, what's your general take on the Vietnam War and how that might relate to the things we see today?
To me, I think what's always been fascinating about the American war in Vietnam is it's really the first time after World War II where Americans are confronted without choice that there are limits to American power overseas. That this is a generation of senior officers and policymakers that are coming out of World War II. They've seen the United States as a global power that has kind of fought against fascism and Nazism and militarism, that it almost has no bounds, right? And for the first time in its recent history, it's confronted with a problem that it just can't solve with military power. And I think we've been grappling with that issue psychologically, militarily, culturally, ever since. And in one sense, I think it's not a lesson that we should be embracing more often today. That we're just not comfortable with the possibility that there are limits to American power. No politician is going to run on a platform saying that we are not exceptional and there are limits to American power. You're not going to win an election that way. But I think the hard part for Americans in the early to mid 1970s is coming to the undeniable conclusion that there are limits, and that we can't accomplish everything that we want to with our military forces. And I think that still resonates today.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that too, because I actually, and I just remembered this, but my wife and I celebrated our 10-year wedding anniversary last year, back when you could travel internationally, which seems like a lifetime.
Right.
Now we went to Vietnam and Cambodia, went to many of the, the sort of the historical and cultural spots. We went to the Hanoi Hilton. That it was still fresh in my mind, the documentary series, and of course it's a war that that in some ways I think people think about sometimes more than these current wars we've been in the Middle East. And seeing the people there, and kind of thinking about the theme of Ken Burns' documentary, they're they're incredible people, right? And they really wanted freedom, and they wanted to be able to determine their own kind of future.
Right.
And we find ourselves in this war, embroiled with these people. It's a losing proposition, right? We're
Right.
not going to be able to take that away from those people. I could
Right.
tell when I met them, these is years later, right, over there. But it's a fascinating place, a beautiful place, and a place where
Right.
people are very proud of their culture. Uh, as the United States is not going to be able to take that away, which is what you would have needed essentially to quote unquote win that war. It seems like.
Yeah, there's no foreign force that is going to have an alternative that's going to be embraced by the Vietnamese people than what Hanoi is offering, and that is independence and unification. And um, I think sometimes we just don't understand that, right? That we see ourselves as liberating forces,
Sure.
but as soon as we enter with military forces into another country, we're oftentimes not seen as liberators, but seen as occupiers. And clearly there's a balance with all this, but I think we sometimes have an um, we have almost too much faith in our capacity to have military power be socially transformative overseas. And in the process of that, I think we tend to discount some of those local historical cultural realities um, that are at play. I mean, the Vietnam War for independence starts long before Americans even know where Vietnam is on a map.
Right.
And we kind of tend to forget that sometimes. And I think that also, I think, is occurred in a larger context of us militarizing our foreign policy, which has not been as healthy as I think
Yeah,
we should be.
let's talk a little bit about that, because I noticed the other day that you had referenced some books that you had had the opportunity to read.
Plenty of time to read, right?
Time we have, which I
Yeah.
think I hope more people are doing that. I know I'd like to do that more if I didn't have to do all that darn distance learning with my allergies.
Right.
But really fascinating books, and I checked some of them out, and there was sort of a common theme. Maybe you can expand on that, but there was some talk about skepticism. There's some skepticism there of the U.S. occupation of territories, how we've treated people in territories, how we've sort of moving, sort of back to the Cold War, thinking about kind of, whether we tend to think we were very successful in the Cold War, whether we really were, and then sort of so thinking about those books that you had a chance to read and some of the anecdotes you were thinking about, playing into what you just said in terms of military force versus perhaps something else, some other way of exerting influence that's more beneficial in the long run.
Yeah, I think I would suggest that one of the aspects of this global pandemic is demonstrating the limits of the utility of military forces, right? That the billions of dollars that we're pouring into the defense budget have been inconsequential to combating this pandemic. And so, we were, in a sense, not ready for this pandemic because we were spending money on the wrong things. If you compare the defense budget as an example to the CDC budget, the CDC budget as a whole, I think, has 1 or less than 1% of the government's budget compared to the military. And so, for me, what has been interesting is we continue to relate what we're seeing today to wartime analogies, whether it's sacrifices and going back to the Surgeon General saying this is our Pearl Harbor moment. We all need to sacrifice together and do something for the greater good of society. I think there are limits to those analogies, I think, and just because we are doing something for the greater good, even if it's just staying at home, that not everything can or should be compared to the United States being at war.
Right.
There's just a lot of problems, I think, with that analogy that, yes, it may bring us together in some instances, but war is also intended to inspire fear and division and militarize the society. And all that sits in tension, I think, with sacrifices. You know,
Yeah.
what's the ceasefire in this war against a pandemic, right? That
Yeah.
we're clearly seeing those debates right now about when we should stop social distancing and get the economy back operating in some sense of where it was
Yeah.
before.
Yeah. It's you haven't heard as much talk about the sort of wartime president or things like that. I think as we've gotten more into this, people have realized, like you say, that the analogy might not be complete there. You know, I saw the other day that I think it was the French president Macron had proposed. I don't know if you've seen this, but sort of like a global ceasefire, a global
Right.
truce during this. Is that something you see as sort of as realistic, where even Russia might get involved? And is that, you think that that's something that might be more long term? Like we could actually come out of this in a better posture militarily, perhaps, in terms of global military action. There could be
Unfortunately, no. I think I'm more pessimistic than that. I don't have as much faith in humankind, and I think in large part because we've seen global pandemics before, right?
Sure.
And if they have lent themselves to more global sense of unity, that hasn't been long lasting. And I think there's always going to be actors out there, either state or non-state actors, that are going to look for advantages in time periods like this, where clearly this is not normal for us. And there will be those out there that wish to do us harm, that are trying to use this as an opportunity to gain some type of advantage, whether it's economically or militarily.
Yeah, it's well, that's I think that's probably the realistic output, or outlook on it. I spent my career in Homeland Security as an attorney, working with law enforcement officers, but the Border Patrol is sort of paramilitary, right? And so there's
Right.
veterans in the Border Patrol, and that's how I've always approached things, right? And from that law enforcement perspective, get the mission, just accomplish the mission, draw on everyone's strengths, get a plan, be tactical, be strategic. But now we find ourselves in this situation with the coronavirus, where certainly there were things that could have been done, perhaps across administrations, to better prepare
Right.
for something like this. But I heard a congressman talking about it the other day, that it's a little bit different than other kinds of oversight from a congressional perspective, because instead of asking, sort of what did you do, are you up to these certain measurements, you're asking them about something that might happen in the future. So it's hard to measure that. So I guess maybe sort of in closing, is there some lesson that that you think that the greater government, federal and state, perhaps can learn about this crisis, for where elected officials and civil servants could use to better prepare in the future for something like this, knowing we might not, it might be something else. It might not be a pandemic. It might be some other climate issue or something.
To me, I think what this has exposed is a need for a more balanced economy, that may in fact need not emergency focused patchworks, which we're seeing now with under the current administration, but some long-term structural reform. That clearly, I think before the pandemic, there was economic disparities in this country that were highlighted, everything from the recent tax codes, where you have major corporations that are paying zero taxes, and I think what this has exposed clearly is that the drivers of this economy are oftentimes the ones that are often most vulnerable. And how you respond to a threat of this measure, whether it's viral or military, or cyber, whatever it may be in the future, I think for us to have a more balanced and stable economy will help us be more flexible in our response to whatever that threat may be. And I think the skewing we have right now, that is clearly leaving so many folks vulnerable to dislocation and an upheaval of the economy, or just of the nation, right? Is something we should think about deeply as all Americans across the aisle, right? That this has exposed, I think, some structural weaknesses in who we are as a nation and how we relate to one another. And I would hope that there is an opportunity here for us to, in one sense, return to normal, but hopefully change that normal a little bit so it's more inclusive for all Americans, and we're not kind of having this problem we see right now of haves versus have-nots. Everything from just social safety to healthcare to job stability we've seen just how the coronavirus has impacted most lower socioeconomic communities, and that should tell us something about what we need to do for the future in terms of responding to whatever may come next.
It's a great point. Yeah, I mean, and that kind of goes to we're only as kind of strong as our most vulnerable, and
Right, exactly.
if we perhaps built the resiliency in that group, because we see too that they're more vulnerable to the virus either because they've got more of the health conditions that make them susceptible. But they're also one paycheck, right, or one bad month as a small business away from perhaps bankruptcy.
Right.
And when our most vulnerable, or those folks that are on the edge, are that susceptible to something, then it's going to hurt all of us, right? And so recalibrating how we look at the economy, like you say, in a more balanced way, perhaps we'd be more resilient to something like this, knowing we may not be able to predict exactly what it is.
Right. If you look at the $740 billion defense budget, it did not help us at all here, right? And so hopefully that will make us reconsider some of our allocations and where we might improve ourselves as a society.
And hopefully that could be done in a bipartisan way, right? I mean, we can only hope for that at least consensus. Well, we'll leave that for another day, but thank you so much, Greg, for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Spending some time with us and just talking about some of these things. I really appreciate it. So yeah, I mean, when we drop this, we'll make some links to the books that you've written.
That'd be great. Thanks.
And thank you for your work, right? Working at Chapman too, helping the next generation of folks be prepared and be themselves more resilient. After all,
exactly.
I think this could make them stronger and bring them together, and I hope that is the case.
Yeah, I hope so.
So thanks for your work there.
All right.
For young people. All right. Well, take care, Greg.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Stay safe.